The architecture faculty at the University of Porto, built between 1985 and 1996 by the architect Alvaro Siza. The story of the architecture faculty begins with a separation. Until 1980, architecture was still taught, as in the 19th century, at the venerable Fine Arts School of Porto, alongside sculpture and painting. But changes in the work and status of architects made further cohabitation impossible. Architecture then left the old Fine Arts School. It would henceforward be taught in a separate faculty at Porto University, in new buildings that were to be built on the campus. By a unanimous decision, the architects on the teaching staff awarded the project to their most prestigious member, Alvaro Siza, a former student of the school. Siza has built numerous buildings in Portugal, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands. He is considered to be one of the leading contemporary architects.
Je suis un fonctionnaliste.
I'm a functionalist. For me, some of the basic issues in the development of a project are its functional problems. Except that the form, spaces, and atmosphere of a building don't arise from its function. This is essential. Every architect is forced to provide answers to functional problems. But architecture, with a capital A, begins when the development and the project attain a capacity of freedom, free of all constraints, able to take flight and develop in other directions. The banks of the Douro on the outskirts of Porto. Here on the right bank, there are still a few south-facing terraced plots of land overlooked by elegant 19th century residences. From 1985 on, the architecture faculty moved into this villa during construction of its new premises. The property was part of a new area of the university campus, near the Lisbon motorway bridge, the last before the estuary. Siza quickly built a first pavilion that he located at the opposite end of the garden. The exterior is deliberately blank, a wall, that nonetheless is spectacularly cantilevered where the roots of a 100-year-old tree need to be preserved. The garden shapes the building, imposing its presence even within the project. The structure is light and hollowed out. The opaque walls of the perimeter contrast with large picture windows that overlook a patio leading to the garden. Siza often has recourse to this basic plan, inspired by 18th century Portuguese houses that form a sort of U with two slightly narrowed arms that create a space between the inside and the outside, both protected and open. When Siza built this first pavilion, total uncertainty continued to reign over the future of the project as a whole. The main faculties were squabbling over the best positions on the site, and the architecture faculty, both new and much smaller with room for only 500 students, wasn't the best place to obtain land and financing. It wasn't until 1986 that it finally obtained the large plot adjacent to the former property. Construction would take many years. The faculty wouldn't be officially inaugurated until 1996. It's a disconcerting set of around 10 separate buildings whose differences have been deliberately accentuated, like the pieces of a puzzle already in place but as yet unassembled. It's hard to figure out how to approach it. The site has a lot to do with this, the triangular shape of the plot of land and its incline, the presence to the north of the faculty of the access roads for the Lisbon motorway. But the architect has also confused the issue by suppressing all the usual markers in a building of this type. No main entrance, no main facade, just a more expressive side facing south. But you have to cross the river to see this, or rather to imagine it. The faculty plays hide and seek among the trees. The architect uses the vegetation to cloak the importance and coherence of the complex, as if he wanted people to believe that his buildings have grown here and there as if by chance. In fact, he has built 4 small towers in a line facing the river. Between the 3rd and 4th tower, an empty space, a missing tooth, where only the base of the building is outlined. As often in Siza's work, there are several explanations for this missing tower. According to some people, the architect's plans were too ambitious, and he had to remove a building to respect the surface area outlined in the specifications. But Siza himself claims that he removed this tower to break an excessively orderly line and to open up the view of the river valley. To the north, on the contrary, enclosure is the rule. 2 large areas linked by a half-circle form a continuous wall along the motorway. The patio, the school's yard, also has an irregular and contrasting shape. A mineral side squeezed like the tip of a triangle. The other side wide open, leading in terraces to the garden of the former property. This shape is partly a result of the plot's initial shape. But whenever the opportunity arises, Siza underlines the fact that the general plan of the faculty is a large-scale reproduction of the shape of the initial pavilion, a U whose base is the wall of the former property. It's as if the project were developing according to its own geometric laws.
Les architectes ont besoin de la géométrie.
Architects need geometry because it helps us to apply more rigorous discipline and organization to the teamwork and need for communication that is at the heart of architecture.
Qui est à l'intérieur de l'architecture, du travail de l'architecture. Mais l'idéal serait d'arriver sur le chantier.
The ideal situation would be to arrive on the work site and be capable or have the possibility of undermining all that by reacting to it, as in music, in jazz, say, between the score and your own inspiration, and, as they say in jazz, the improvisation. The program required the architect to build classrooms for 500 students, administrative offices, a large auditorium, an exhibition hall, and a library. Siza took the option of deliberately separating these different aspects. All teaching activities are located on one side of the complex, the most beautiful and calmest side, the riverside. The division of the project into towers is perfectly adapted to the educational program drawn up at the same time, and that places the accent on work in small groups, which entails a large number of small classrooms. These are simple, unembellished spaces, identical from one floor to the next, one tower to the next. The only distinguishing features are the windows like loopholes that Siza uses like frames to create views of the landscape. Openings that he stretches or contracts in all directions and whose perfectly controlled irregularity allows him to break the monotony of his basic units. Variations on the theme of the tower. Siza says that he had the idea of the towers on noticing the apartment blocks from the 1950s that rise up behind the faculty. He wished to pay tribute to these buildings. One of the permanent aspects of his work is this reaction to the buildings around him. He doesn't like working in isolation. But irony is never far away in his work. There's something mischievous about these buildings with their outlandish capped and helmeted outlines that look almost human. Even so, this formal diversity is the result of simple technical imperatives barely reinterpreted by the architect. The Iroquois headdress of the highest tower conceals the north-facing windows of the design workshop. These two large sun visors that Siza chose to place vertically transform the neighboring tower completely. This formal variety contrasts with the large blank walls of the northern buildings, where Siza has housed all the faculty's collective services and large-scale installations. The students have the river view. The offices have the motorway view. A genuine architectural decision. To the north, a climate of war reigns. The faculty, assaulted by the traffic on the Lisbon motorway access roads, is defended by a barrier made of 3 terraced buildings whose bulky appearance is counterbalanced by ruptures in their positioning, the tensions between the curves, straight lines, and diagonals. But these zigzags are yet another way of clearly underlining the order of the program. The first block houses the auditorium, the half circle the exhibition hall, and the final block the library. The organization of a building must be very clear. I don't like buildings where you feel lost, where you cannot work out which path to follow. Even though, exceptionally, I like labyrinths, although a labyrinth is something different. But basically, you need to have a very clear and obvious layout, along with some alternatives, not something imposed. The itinerary is a very important theme in the general makeup of a building. It's the link between the different areas. It cannot be imposed, or a building soon loses its meaning. It's all over. You can't order people to go one way or another. No, there are other needs, and the relationship between these areas must extend into a great freedom of use. Siza, a former fine arts student, is fully aware of the fact that the most important part of a student's life doesn't take place in the classroom or the library, but between the two. He has designed the faculty as a small town, using the slope of the land to create numerous collective areas, such as this tiny shady square, a sort of second courtyard and counterpart of the main patio. In this way, all journeys within the faculty are split in two. The patio itself is a sort of hub serving all the buildings. But you can also go from one tower to the next via a long underground corridor passing beneath the patio and linking the towers. This corridor ends in another small square where either a ramp or a staircase leads up to the north building. This may not be a labyrinth, but it certainly looks like one. Movement around the north building follows much clearer lines. This diagonal shelters an inclined ramp used for most journeys around the building. The inclined ramp is the playful conception of movement. It clears the space, opens up the view, and turns the journey into a spectacle. The way that Siza enjoys playing with sharp angles and diagonals makes the architecture faculty like a cubist sculpture. At times, he comes up against an obstacle, a right angle, a straight vertical like this pillar resulting from a structural imperative. Never mind. The architect becomes a sculptor and decks the pillar with a sort of false nose, a purely decorative effect. But it's the architect's desire to force all the elements to take part in this vast game of diagonals, present throughout the building, from its most open spaces to other, more secret ones.
Dans un bâtiment, j'aime la lumière.
In a building, I like the light,
Mais aussi j'aime la
but
pénombre.
I also like the half-light. Is that the word? And even the darkness, too.
L'obscurité même aussi. Sont des choses.
They're related, complementary things. And in a southern country, this idea of the depth and variation in the light is very important.
Très importante, non? Et on a toujours l'idée dans
We
la
always
mémoire
think of complexes and structures like,
complexe,
for instance,
structure,
an example that comes to
un
mind,
exemple qui j'ai
like,
dans la mémoire, dans mon esprit.
like the Alhambra in Granada,
Alhambra de Granada, où on est dans
where
le
you're in a
jardin,
garden,
envahi
flooded
par la
with the
lumière,
light of the
soleil,
sun,
et on entre
and
dans
you
un
enter
espace,
another
on passe
area
dans un patio
and step into a
qui a des
patio
galeries
with
qui protègent
arcades
dans
sheltering
l'ombre,
it
et on entre
that
dans
provide
une
shadow,
loggia où
and then you go into a
la lumière
loggia
est plus
where the light is less
intense, et on
intense,
passe dans une
and you go
autre
into
chambre,
another room where there is a little
il y a
half-light,
quelques pénombres, et on va
and
jusqu'à
you
la
move toward
sérénité
total
totale.
serenity.
Et ça sont des dimensions
Architecture
de
must never lose sight of these dimensions and must use them.
doit l'utiliser.
This circular ramp and the exhibition area that the architect has concealed behind it have supplementary lighting from the roof. Once again, it's the outcome of a deliberate choice, that of treating the walls as vast blank areas, contrary to the transparency effects that have become one of the clichés of modern architecture. Here, the architect has imagined glass roofs whose design is all the more surprising since no one is supposed to see them. Two large round indentations let in the light of day. It bounces off the reflective surfaces hidden by false ceilings. Filtered and modeled in this way, the light seems to be coming from the very curve of the wall. In the adjacent library, the zenithal light source forms a stark contrast in the reading room that an inverted glass roof cuts into two like a blade. Another play on diagonals and sharp angles, another spectacular and surprising effect that, coming after so many other coups de théâtre and bravura displays, could seem tiring. However, that would mean forgetting that we're not in an ordinary building, but in a school whose very object is architecture. The abundance of solutions isn't an end in itself here. Aimed at apprentice architects, it's a continual incitement to reconsider space. A building built by an architect for other architects. A sort of ideal city of architecture. But this isn't what Siza was aiming for. The faculty entrance isn't at the tip of the triangle. Siza planned it 100 yards or so away. There, the architect has built a kiosk in his style, both open and simple, slightly askew, and with just a hint of irony. A sort of airlock through which the faculty was to communicate with the rest of the campus. But clearly it hasn't worked. Because of the lack of funds for peripheral installations, because of the lack of interest of the great faculties for the more recent among them, and its odd-looking buildings, the faculty has ended up with unfinished surroundings, huddled up on itself, invisible to everyone except the clued-in motorist who manages to make out this sign at 50 miles an hour. The faculty today. But in the architect's drawers, another drawing tells a different story. Such as this one, where the ghost of the missing tower continues to feature. Or this one, even older, where the buildings gradually knit together and where we discover the birth of the project in reverse. The triangle closing and altering until it becomes a simple cube, the initial drawing, the first idea. Siza found his inspiration for this hollowed-out cube plan in the finest building in Old Porto, the Bishop's Palace, that also dominates the banks of the Douro. In the mind of the faculty's architect, the most important thing that he had ever been asked to build in his home city had to be the modern counterpart of the old palace. But the trouble is, a few miles away, it's no longer the same city. And rather than obstinately strive for his dream of monumental grandeur, Siza chose to shatter his project, to harmonize it with the jumble surrounding it, simply because that's the world that he builds in. A world where the only place that his building can be seen from in its entirety is a hypermarket car park.
Il y a un commencement
You begin with an image,
ou d'une idée de
with an idea
fruition
of
de l'espace.
friction, of
Une idée de
between
rapport
areas,
avec tout
a notion of the relationship to other buildings.
de la ville. Et pour moi, c'est très important.
And for me,
avoir
it's
ces
very important to
idées
have
un
this
peu
slightly
gratuites
gratuitous or rather unstable idea that forms the start of the guideline to thinking about the project.
de la réflexion sur le projet. Après tout,
After that, anything is possible. You can change direction. You can abandon the initial plans and shatter the building.
C'est une chose qui a un
But it's a thing that has a beginning, and that will have a goal.
un objectif, il y aura, bon, j'allais dire,
I was going to say that there will be an end, but
ça n'est
that's
pas
not
fait.
true since a building is never finished.
Il y a une vie qui va.
There's a life that goes on beyond our work on it.
Et pour moi,
And for me,
presque toujours,
whenever I finish a building,
en
I nearly always feel disgust and concern.
Parce que je sais bien qu'il n'est pas fini.
Disgust because I know that it's not finished,
Pouvait se
that
développer
there are
ce
all
qui est
kinds of
déjà
things
fait.
that could develop
Mais
from
aussi,
what has
je
already
sais
been
que
done.
c'est un peu
But I also know that this is merely obsession and egotism,
égoïsme.
because a building lives on without
fini
us.
au-delà de nous.